My son stole $200,000 from me, and I didn't even realize it until the bank sent me a foreclosure notice. I'm 67, a retired bank accountant. I live alone in a small apartment and spend my mornings with tea, crossword puzzles, and silence. Nothing prepared me for the morning I opened that envelope. My name, my social security number, my signature. But I never signed a thing. The bank told me the money had already been transferred, not to my account, but to my son's. The same son I trusted with access in case I ever got sick. The same son who married a woman that looked me in the eye and said, "You're going to die soon anyway. Why do you need the money?" That was the moment something inside me snapped. And what I did next, they never saw coming. The day began like any other. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen, and Margaret Holloway eased herself into her favorite armchair by the window, watching the sun stretch its golden arms across the quiet Ohio street. At 67, she had long embraced the calm that came after decades of chaos, raising a child, losing a husband, surviving the small heartbreaks that accumulate over a lifetime. Her life now was simple, predictable, safe, until the mail arrived. The envelope was thick, official-looking, marked First Republic Bank in a bold serif font. She nearly tossed it aside with the usual pile of credit card offers and utility statements. But something about the weight of it made her pause. She slid a letter opener along the edge, unfolded the document, and adjusted her reading glasses. Her eyes skimmed over the text, then stopped, then reread. Her name, Margaret Holloway. A personal loan, $200,000 in origination date 2 weeks ago. Monthly payment $9,963.47. Her breath caught. She blinked hard, sure she was misreading something. But no, there it was, in black and white. Her signature scrawled neatly at the bottom. She hadn't signed anything. Her first thought was scam, a phishing attempt. She set the letter down and turned to her laptop, pulling up her online banking dashboard. But when the screen loaded, her hands began to tremble. The balance had changed. A large deposit had been made mid-month. And that deposit was already gone, transferred, not to a company, not to an unfamiliar name, to Ethan Holloway, her son. Margaret sat very still, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Her tea had gone cold beside her. Ethan, her Ethan, the same boy she'd cradled through fevers, defended at parent-teacher conferences, stayed up late tutoring through high school algebra. The same man who, 5 years ago after her husband died, insisted she add him to her bank account. Just in case anything ever happens to you, Mom. She remembered how touched she'd been by his concern. She also remembered that she'd never removed him after that. It was supposed to be a precaution, something responsible, something family did for each other. Now it was betrayal. She reached for the phone, her fingers stiff and shaking, dialed the customer service number on the letterhead. First Republic Bank, this is Amanda. How may I assist you today? Margaret's voice wavered. Yes, I received a letter about a loan I never applied for. My name is Margaret Holloway. Okay, Ms. Holloway, let me just verify your account. All right, I see the loan you're referring to. It was processed and approved on July 21st. $200,000. The funds were deposited into your account the next day. I didn't apply for any loan, Margaret said, the words dry in her mouth. There was a pause. Well, according to our records, the application was submitted online using your social security number and electronic signature. It looks like the funds were then transferred to a joint account holder, Ethan Holloway. The silence stretched. Amanda's voice softened. Ms. Holloway, is Ethan a family member? My son, Margaret whispered. I see. He's been an authorized user on your account since September 2020. 5 years. 5 years of quiet access. Trust, unmonitored. It all made sense now. Every unexplained transaction, every small withdrawal she had chalked up to her own forgetfulness. The casualness with which Ethan had once mentioned needing to move some money around during a tough month. She had believed him. She had always believed him. Margaret ended the call politely, as if manners could make the betrayal hurt less. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the letter again. This wasn't just about money. It was about something far worse. It was about being invisible, dispensable. About how easily the people you love can calculate your worth in dollars and decide you're no longer worth protecting. Outside, the sun still shone. Inside, Margaret Holloway's world had shifted forever. The letter didn't leave Margaret's hands for hours. It lay on the kitchen table beside her now empty teacup, as though it might transform into something else if she stared at it long enough. When it didn't, she got up. Years of working as a bank accountant had taught her one thing. Numbers never lie. People do. But not numbers. And if Ethan had done this once, maybe he had done it before. She pulled the file box from her closet, a dented gray container labeled Statements Past Years. Her organizational habits hadn't faded with age. Margaret had every printed monthly statement from the past 5 years, each in neat chronological order. She spread them out on the table and began to scan them, eyes trained to spot discrepancies the way a seasoned chef might recognize a missing spice. Within 20 minutes, the hairs on the back of her neck began to rise. Small transfers, $500 here, whiling $200 there. Withdrawals she hadn't remembered authorizing. At first glance, they were sporadic enough to dismiss, but the deeper she went, the more they revealed a pattern, the same recipient names, slightly varied amounts. She began writing them down. March 3rd, 1,215 to LM Enterprises. April 14th, $980 to Crestfield Holdings. May 7th, $2,100 to Vantage Path LLC. All through a series of online bill payments listed in obscure language. Corporate-sounding names, none of which rang a bell. She turned to her laptop and began to search. Each of the companies listed was either a dissolved shell company or a newly registered LLC with no website, no contact number, and in one case, an address that led to an empty lot in Nevada. This wasn't just personal debt. This was money laundering. A chill settled over her. Not the kind from cold air, but the deep, bone-aching kind that came with dread. Her son had used her accounts not just to steal, but to hide something bigger. Maybe his own financial mess, or worse, someone else's. One of the transfers had gone to a name that didn't even sound real, Verena C. Baldwin. She searched again. No online presence, no social security trace. But a different statement, one she found from June, showed a different name associated with the same account number, C. Holloway Holdings, her daughter-in-law's initials, Camilla. Margaret stood slowly, heart pounding harder now. Something dark began to swirl in her chest, far more toxic than confusion or even betrayal. It was rage, but not the kind that screamed or wept. It was quieter, heavier. The kind that simmers. She didn't call Ethan, she didn't warn him. Instead, she got dressed, pulled her keys from the hook by the door, and walked to the garage. The Honda Civic started with a reluctant purr. She backed out of the driveway with mechanical precision, her eyes sharp and unblinking. There was no plan, no rehearsed speech, only the document in her purse and the question she couldn't live without answering. Why? Why would he do this to her? The drive across town to Ethan's house took 20 minutes, long enough to second-guess herself. But each time she did, she remembered Camilla's voice from the bank call. "You're going to die soon anyway. Why do you need the money?" Those words had become a metronome in her mind. The neighborhood came into view, sleek, polished, and sterile. Houses built to impress more than to live in. The kind of neighborhood that measured success in square footage and luxury cars. Margaret parked at the curb, suddenly aware of how out of place her car looked in the manicured driveways. She walked up the stone path to the front door, her fingers tightening around the bank letter in her purse like a soldier clutching a weapon. No one answered the first knock. The second time, the door opened, and there he was, Ethan, her son, the man she had raised, protected, believed in. He looked tired, but not guilty, just inconvenienced. "Mom," he said, surprised. "You okay?" "No," she answered, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "We need to talk." Margaret had been to Ethan's house only once before. It was during their housewarming party, when the paint on the walls was still fresh and the marble countertops gleamed like something out of a luxury catalog. She'd felt out of place then. Today, the feeling was 100 times worse. The gates opened automatically as she approached, her old Civic creeping into a neighborhood full of polished BMWs, black-tinted Range Rovers, and manicured hedges clipped within a millimeter of perfection. The houses weren't just homes, they were statements, monuments to ambition, to status, to curated perfection. Every window shimmered with new wealth, every driveway whispered luxury. Ethan's house sat near the cul-de-sac, tall and angular with glass-paneled doors and a fountain that bubbled quietly near the entrance. A stark contrast to Margaret's one-bedroom apartment with a squeaky radiator and windows that rattled in the wind. She stepped out of the car and stared for a long moment, her grip on her purse tightening. The weight of the bank statement seemed heavier than ever. The front door swung open before she could knock again. Ethan looked surprised. "Mom?" he asked, eyebrows lifting. "You okay?" "No," she said, voice steady. "We need to talk." He moved aside and she stepped in. The interior hit her like a cold slap. Rich wood floors, custom lighting, walls decorated with abstract art that probably cost more than her monthly pension. A chandelier sparkled overhead, absurd in the midday light. "You didn't call," Ethan said cautiously, following her down the hall. "I didn't feel like waiting," Margaret replied. They reached the kitchen. Sleek granite counters, a vase of fresh tulips perfectly centered. She reached into her purse, pulled out the letter, and laid it on the island. "What's this?" Ethan asked, frowning as he leaned over the page. "You tell me," she said. He read silently, then blinked. "Wait, this can't be right. A loan? 200,000? He looked up at her, eyes wide, too wide. Margaret said nothing, just watched. Mom, I swear, I don't know what this is. Maybe there's been some kind of mistake." She raised an eyebrow. "Your name is listed. The transfer went directly into your account." He hesitated. The performance slipped. Then he sighed and leaned back against the counter. Okay, yes, I took it." The confession came out flat, practiced. "You what?" Margaret whispered, though she'd already known. Ethan lifted his hands in a helpless gesture. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to pay it back. We needed it. Camilla's business was struggling. The mortgage, the car payments, things got tight." "You stole from me," Margaret said quietly. "You forged my name." "I didn't steal," Ethan said quickly. "I borrowed. You always said family helps each other. I thought you'd understand." Margaret's jaw clenched. "I trusted you with my account for emergencies after your father died. That wasn't permission to rob me blind." "I didn't rob you," he snapped, and then softened his tone immediately. "Look, I was desperate. We had no other options. It was just easier this way." Before she could respond, a pair of heels clicked against the marble floor. Camilla appeared at the top of the staircase, dressed in designer loungewear, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect ponytail. She looked down at them as though surveying peasants in her foyer. "What's going on?" she asked, voice syrupy with disdain. Margaret turned, her stomach twisting. "I'm here to discuss the $200,000 loan your husband took in my name." Camilla descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. When she reached the kitchen, she didn't even glance at the document. Instead, she poured herself a sparkling water from a glass dispenser on the counter. "Oh, that," she said. "You're making such a fuss over something so small." Margaret stared at her. "Small?" "You're old," Camilla said matter-of-factly. "What do you even need that money for? You'll be dead in a few years anyway. Isn't it better knowing you helped your son live well now?" The words sliced through the air like a blade. Margaret flinched. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Camilla smiled, thin and cruel. "Honestly, you should be grateful we're giving you a purpose. Most old people just rot away with nothing." Something inside Margaret shattered. All the years of sacrifice, all the nights spent working overtime, all the savings she'd guarded for emergencies, for dignity, for survival, gone. And now this woman, this stranger she'd accepted as family, had reduced her existence to a ticking clock and an empty bank account. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not here. Not in this house of polished lies. Margaret waited for Ethan to speak, to correct his wife, to say something. But he didn't. He rubbed his temple and muttered, "Camilla, that's not exactly fair." "Oh, please," she cut him off. "You said it yourself. She's never going to use that money. She eats toast for dinner and still reuses tea bags." Ethan didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn toward his mother with regret or guilt or even mild discomfort. He just stared at the countertop, like it might offer him an escape route. Margaret felt her stomach twist, not from rage, but something colder, a hollowness, like air escaping a balloon. The silence stretched as Camilla walked away, heels clicking like punctuation marks in a conversation that had already ended. "I think I should go," Margaret said, voice calm but brittle. Ethan gave a half shrug. "If that's what you want." "What I want." She turned without another word and walked out of the house, each step down the long driveway feeling heavier than the last. The sun had shifted by the time she reached her car. The heat settled over her shoulders, but she didn't notice it. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe Camilla was behind it all. Maybe Ethan had just gone along because he was pressured, manipulated. It wouldn't be the first time someone married into a family and started pulling strings behind the scenes. Yes, that had to be it. Ethan wasn't a criminal. He was weak. He was misled. He would come around. The drive home was silent. The only sound was the ticking of her turn signals and the occasional whisper of wind through the cracked window. She walked into her apartment and set her purse down with mechanical precision, shoes off, keys on the hook. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at nothing. Then she noticed the envelope. It sat on her table where her earlier mail had been. Another official-looking document from First Republic Bank, her name in bold, a red-stamped word across the top, urgent. She opened it slowly, her fingers suddenly numb. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. The words blurred for a moment before snapping into terrifying clarity. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in foreclosure proceedings on any assets used to secure the loan. As you were listed as the primary borrower, your residence is subject to asset recovery. She reread it. Then again. They were going to take her apartment. Not someday, not in theory, now. She reached for her phone, hands trembling. Ethan answered after the third ring. "Hey, Mom," her voice cracked. "Ethan, I just got a letter from the bank. They're moving forward with foreclosure. If we don't pay something soon, I'll lose my home." There was a pause. Then he sighed. "Mom, we've talked about this. You're blowing it out of proportion." "I'm not," she said quickly. "They sent me legal documents. They're starting the process. I need help." "Help with what?" he asked flatly. "You're the one who got upset about us using the money. Now you want help paying it back?" "I'm about to lose everything." "Well," he said with a short, dismissive breath, "maybe you should have thought about that before calling me a thief in my own kitchen." "I didn't call you a... You showed up uninvited, tried to shame me in front of my wife, and now you want me to come running because you got scared." Her breath caught. "Ethan, I'm your mother." "Yeah, and I'm an adult. I have my own life. You need to stop acting like this is some grand betrayal. Families help each other." "Help?" she repeated. "You stole from me." "I'm done with this guilt trip, Mom. You're the one who's choosing to turn this into drama. I have enough stress without dealing with your crises." And then the line went dead. Margaret lowered the phone slowly, her knuckles white from how tightly she had been holding it. The silence in her apartment was suffocating. No ticking clock, no television in the background, just the raw, unfiltered sound of abandonment. She sank into her chair and let the stillness wrap around her. Her mind spiraled. Years of sacrifice, of budgeting every penny, of working overtime so Ethan could go to college, so Camilla could have a lavish wedding. All of it weaponized against her. Something inside her shifted, not a collapse, a click, a quiet decision forming in the center of her chest. She stood up, walked to her desk, and pulled open the drawer where she kept her old files. The banking records, the savings logs, the emergency contacts she hadn't touched in years. Margaret Holloway may have been betrayed, but she hadn't forgotten how to fight. The weight of betrayal sat heavily on Margaret's shoulders, but she didn't crumble. Not this time. Years of banking discipline had trained her to respond to problems with structure, not emotion. She moved like someone following muscle memory, the instinct of a woman who had once balanced accounts with 6 zeros, uncovered discrepancies in layers of digits, and trained younger staff to think like detectives rather than clerks. She cleared off her dining table, replaced her floral tablecloth with a stack of manila folders, a spiral notebook, and her aging laptop. Each click of the keyboard echoed with a new kind of purpose. She began with her own bank, reviewing every monthly statement going back 2 years, every auto payment, every ACH transfer, every recipient and origin source. It was slow work, but she was meticulous, highlighting transactions, cross-referencing account numbers, tracing patterns. She noticed things she hadn't seen before, withdrawals with vague references, deposits that didn't align with any known source, names she didn't recognize appearing again and again. But Margaret knew this wasn't something she could do alone, not entirely. So she opened her old Rolodex, the real one, yellowed and faded, with names written in blue ink that had begun to bleed through the years. Linda Marshall, former co-worker, handled commercial accounts. Geraldine Pike, retired fraud analyst, used to play bridge with Margaret before life got too complicated. Paul Riggs, once the compliance officer at Horizon Credit Union. She picked up the phone. Linda answered first. "Margaret? Well, it's been years." After the pleasantries, Margaret didn't waste time. "Linda, I need your help. This is off the record." Linda paused. "What's going on?" "My son took out a $200,000 loan in my name, forged the signature. There's more. I think he tried to do it elsewhere, too." Another pause, then a low, professional hum. "I'll see what I can dig up." By the end of the next day, Linda called back. "I ran a quiet check. Your hunch was right. Your name showed up in 3 separate loan applications within the last 12 months. Same social security number, same date of birth, same online submission patterns." Margaret's pulse quickened. Where? Commerce Bank, Union Fidelity, and Crescent Pacific. All denied the loan. All flagged signature irregularities and inconsistencies between submitted documents and official samples. 3 applications, 3 rejections, all in her name. But not one of them had been brought to her attention until now. "Did they report it?" she asked. "Not if there was no financial loss. It's common. They just close the file and flag the account quietly." Margaret thanked her, heart pounding with something sharper than before. Not just betrayal, but the realization that this hadn't been a moment of weakness. This was systematic, repeated, calculated. She had been a target. Her identity, her trust, had been weaponized. Next, she called Geraldine. "Forgery is trickier than people think," Geraldine said, "especially with online submissions. Banks rely on algorithmic signature matching. If the baseline sample is weak, the system assumes the best match wins." Margaret explained about the prior applications. Geraldine sighed. If he got bold enough to use your credentials across institutions, it means he believed he could outsmart the filters, or that someone taught him how. The implications sank in slowly. This wasn't just Ethan messing around with stolen access. Someone had either coached him or provided the means, a deeper network. Or Camilla. Margaret reached for her pen, writing across the top of her notebook in block letters. Not an accident. A pattern. A plan. By the following morning, she had started charting everything on a corkboard. Old school, maybe, but it helped her visualize. She connected names, dates, amounts, and outcomes. Her kitchen looked like a mini war room. That's when she called Paul Riggs. He still worked part-time as a consultant, and she knew he would never ignore a call from someone like her. Paul didn't disappoint. Commerce Bank, he said, flagged your application back in November. Their underwriting software found anomalies. Handwriting analysis raised red flags. The loan was pulled before disbursement, but your name was definitely used. Margaret felt her hands tighten into fists. He's been using my information for over a year. Looks like it, Paul confirmed, and each time he got better at disguising it. Until he finally succeeded, she whispered, with First Republic. Her thoughts began to line up. Ethan hadn't just made one bad decision. He'd rehearsed it, practiced. Each failed application, a dress rehearsal for the final act, and Margaret, ever the trusting mother, had unknowingly been the stage. It all clicked now. The emergency contact status, the shared online access, the casual way he once said, "Don't worry, I've got this." He hadn't been helping her. He'd been preparing to exploit her. Margaret stood from the table, her spine straighter than it had been in days. She walked to the mirror in her hallway and looked at her reflection. Not the woman Ethan saw, fragile and forgettable, but someone else. A strategist, a mother scorned, a retired professional who knew how systems worked and how to bring them down from within. Margaret's corkboard had turned into a tangled web of red strings and printed documents. She stared at it one evening with her glasses perched low on her nose, her fingers stained with highlighter ink. For someone outside the picture, it might have looked like a conspiracy board, but Margaret knew better. This wasn't theory, it was proof. A pattern of betrayal layered beneath a calm domestic surface. One name kept popping up across several flagged transactions from the last 3 months. A transfer account listed under M. Vaughn, tied to a private banking entity in Oregon, flagged twice in her account history for irregular routing. Margaret had never heard of the name, Melissa Vaughn. She searched her own memory, flipping through decades of contacts, friends, family connections. Nothing. She called Linda again. "Does the name Melissa Vaughn mean anything to you?" Margaret asked. There was a pause on the other end. "No. Why?" Her name showed up on 2 intermediate wire transfers between my account and what I assume is a laundering step before funds reach Ethan. "I can look into it," Linda offered, her voice sharpening with professional focus. "But that sounds like a proxy name. People use false IDs to build shell accounts, especially in private banking where scrutiny is lower." Exactly what Margaret feared. Later that afternoon, Geraldine called unexpectedly. "I did some background checking," she said. "That account you mentioned, Ms. Vaughn, it's been linked to 3 flagged transactions in Oregon's underground lending database." Margaret sat upright. Underground? It's a semi-legal system, mostly used by high-risk borrowers and shell corporations, sometimes by people trying to hide money trails. Margaret closed her eyes. "You think Camilla is using it?" "Could be. Or someone acting on her behalf. But if Melissa Vaughn shows up in both your transaction logs and in those underground databases, that's no coincidence." Another puzzle piece clicked into place. Still, Margaret needed more. She needed confirmation. That night, she placed a discreet call to an old contact at the State Regulatory Board, someone she once mentored, now working in compliance at the Financial Crimes Division. She didn't explain everything. Just enough. "I need an off-the-record lookup," she said. "Private banking records. Name's Melissa Vaughn. Recent activity, Oregon-based. The woman on the other end, Rachel, paused. You're serious? I am. Rachel took a breath. Give me a few hours. Margaret waited, pacing her apartment. She checked the documents, reread the letters, looked at her board again and again. Just past midnight, her phone rang. Rachel's voice was clipped, professional but laced with unease. I shouldn't even be telling you this, but I ran the identity through our internal filters. The social security number tied to Melissa Vaughn doesn't exist in any federal database. Fake name? Yes, and it gets better. The IP address used to create the banking profile, same as one registered to a personal account belonging to Camilla Reese. Margaret's blood ran cold. You're sure? We're 98% confident. There's a digital footprint, browser fingerprints, metadata links. Whoever Melissa Vaughn is, she only exists online. But all her activity traces back to your daughter-in-law. Margaret sank into her chair. The room spun slightly, not from surprise, but from clarity. All the whispers her gut had been trying to warn her about suddenly turned into screams. Camilla wasn't just complicit. She was the architect. All those luxury bags, the renovations, the wine tastings, and Instagram-perfect vacations. They weren't Ethan's indulgences. They were Camilla's illusions, funded by stolen money and fraudulent identities. Margaret felt the walls of deception close in, but not on her, on them. The pity she once held for Ethan began to morph into something colder, because if Camilla had orchestrated this, Ethan had allowed it, or worse, encouraged it. She thought back to that day in the mansion kitchen, where Camilla had stood in silk and sneered, "You're going to die soon anyway." Now she knew those weren't just cruel words. They were strategy. Erase the old woman. Inherit the bank account. Margaret stood slowly and walked to her bedroom mirror. For the first time in years, she really looked at herself, not as someone grieving the loss of trust, but as someone preparing for battle. This wasn't just about reclaiming money anymore. It was about reclaiming identity and exposing the woman who wore luxury like armor, but built her kingdom on lies. Margaret hadn't followed anyone in decades, not since her days at the bank when she helped trace patterns in embezzlement cases. But back then, it had been spreadsheets and transaction trails. Now, it was her life, her dignity, her stolen future. She dusted off an old digital camera from her hall closet, a relic from her husband's photography days. It still worked. The battery held. The lens adjusted with a satisfying click. She grabbed a scarf, her oldest coat, and left just before noon. Camilla's routine wasn't hard to trace. Her social media was a breadcrumb trail of vanity. Tags, locations, timestamps, designer stores. Margaret started at the boutique plaza near Riverfront Park, where Camilla often posted about treating herself on Wednesdays. Margaret parked across the street and waited, nerves tight as piano wire. Sure enough, just past 12:30, a sleek black SUV pulled into a premium spot out front. Camilla stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, her platinum blonde hair cascading like a shampoo commercial. She didn't walk. She floated straight into Nordstrom with the elegance of someone who'd never clipped a coupon in her life. Margaret followed on foot, keeping a respectful distance. Inside, she hovered near the jewelry section, pretending to admire the displays, while keeping her camera low in her oversized tote bag. Camilla breezed past the counters and waved at a sales associate who clearly knew her by name. Then came the twist Margaret wasn't ready for. A man appeared, tall, early 30s, sharp suit, effortless confidence. He leaned in, kissed Camilla on the cheek, not a friend's greeting, but something closer, intimate, familiar. Margaret's stomach flipped. The man picked up a watch from the glass case, admired it briefly, then turned toward Camilla. She took the piece from his hand, removed the price tag, and whispered something in his ear that made him laugh. His hand touched her lower back in a motion so casual, it screamed practiced affection. Margaret didn't breathe. She raised her camera and clicked. Once, Twice. 3 times. Click. Camilla holding the watch. Click. The man, who the associate addressed as Mr. Reed, slipping the timepiece onto his wrist. Click. A sales receipt for $2,846.79 signed under the name C. Anderson. Camilla paid, with a card tied to Margaret's stolen credit line. They walked out laughing, arms brushing, the kind of closeness that didn't belong between a wife and anyone other than her husband. Margaret followed them to a nearby Italian restaurant. They sat at a patio table, their sunglasses catching the sun, their movements synchronized. Camilla fed him a bite of dessert off her fork. She photographed that too. Then they left together, climbed into the SUV, and disappeared toward the northern hills. Margaret sat in her car long after they were gone, the camera resting on her lap, heart pounding louder than the traffic. She reviewed the images, each one a betrayal, each one a piece of proof. This wasn't just financial abuse, it was personal. Camilla had stolen Margaret's identity, forged her name, drained her accounts, and now she was spending that stolen wealth on a lover, Marcus Reed. The name was unfamiliar, but the betrayal wasn't. Margaret had seen affairs before. Friends, neighbors, clients at the bank who walked in with joint accounts and walked out with secrets. But this was something else. Camilla wasn't cheating out of love. She was cheating with intention, with strategy. This was a woman who had planned every step of her life, from marrying Ethan, to draining his mother's finances, to financing her affair with luxurious flair. Margaret drove home in silence. No music, no phone calls. She laid out the photographs on her kitchen table, lining them next to the bank documents and flagged transactions. A new timeline formed. March 1st, loan approved under forged signature. March 2nd, funds transferred to Ethan. March 3rd onward, daily withdrawals, many tied to shopping centers. March 6th, first flagged transaction to M. Vaughn account. March 8th, watch purchased for Marcus Reed. It wasn't just timing, it was precision. The way Camilla operated was clinical, cold, professional even. Margaret rubbed her temples. The betrayal by Ethan had wounded her, yes, but she had blamed weakness, naivety, misplaced trust. She wanted to believe he was manipulated, dragged into something he didn't fully understand. But this? Camilla was no pawn. She was the queen. And Marcus? A reward, an accomplice. A man who lived well off money, meant to support a woman in her final years. Margaret's rage was quiet but deep. It wasn't the firestorm of shouting or smashed plates. It was the kind that crystallized into resolve, that sharpened the mind rather than dulling it. She picked up the camera and started printing. She emailed copies to herself, saved backups on a flash drive, and labeled every folder with dates and cross-references. She was building something, and she didn't even fully know what yet, but it would be big. That night, she stared at the photo of Camilla smiling across the table at Marcus, wine glass raised in mid-toast. The caption in Margaret's mind came unbidden, to stolen years and broken vows. And yet, it wasn't sadness that overwhelmed her, it was strategy. Because now, she knew who she was really up against, and Margaret Holloway had never lost a fight she'd prepared for. Margaret returned the next morning to the same upscale shopping district. The camera now felt like an extension of her hands, no longer a tool for discovery. It had become a weapon, proof, shield, record of war. She sat in her car across from the parking garage, eyes fixed on the entrance of the boutique hotel Camilla often tagged online. Her gut told her they weren't done. At exactly 10:42 a.m., the black SUV appeared again. Camilla emerged first, dressed in a cashmere coat and dark lipstick, the kind she never wore around Ethan. She looked like a different woman, more confident, more dangerous. Then Marcus stepped out from the passenger side. Margaret clicked the shutter. They walked inside together. She gave them 20 minutes, then followed. Margaret wasn't foolish. She didn't try to enter or make a scene. She waited in the lounge, pretending to sip coffee, camera angled at the front desk. When the clerk turned away, Margaret zoomed in. There it was, room 312. She didn't need photos from inside. What mattered was time, location, identity, the timestamp from her camera, the names logged on the hotel system, their arrival and departure. As the couple exited 2 hours later, sunglasses back on, their arms brushing as they stepped into the street, Margaret raised her lens again. Their smiles weren't just intimate. They were victorious, like people who'd gotten away with something, but not today. Margaret went home, downloaded the images, tagged the metadata. She didn't just store the photos, she prepared them like exhibits in a courtroom. Then she dug deeper. She searched Marcus Reed online. The name pulled up a few vague LinkedIn pages, no clear matches. But when she filtered through local business registrations and loan co-applicants in Eastern Washington, something sparked. Name, Marcus Webb. Listed as co-signer on 2 rejected personal loan applications from Crescent Pacific and Union Fidelity, submitted under the joint names of Melissa Vaughn and Marcus Webb. Melissa Vaughn, Camilla's fake identity. Marcus Webb, her lover. Margaret leaned back slowly, heart steady but breath caught in her throat. They'd done this before, together. They weren't just an affair, they were a team. Loan fraud, stolen identities, ghost accounts. They had a pattern, a partnership, a pipeline. Margaret pulled up the copies of her own forged documents again, the digital fingerprints, the IP address that traced to Camilla's device. It was all the same playbook, the same signatures, the same digital trails, the same scam. Twist after twist, unraveled like thread from an old sweater. Every betrayal now had a structure, a logic. Marcus had likely been with Camilla long before Ethan even proposed, or if not, he joined her soon after. And together they had created a system, marry into wealth, steal quietly, move funds, and vanish once the well ran dry. But what about Ethan? Was he just a pawn? Or had he known everything? Margaret wrestled with that question as she organized her files. If Ethan knew, he was a traitor in full. If he didn't, he was a fool, a blind husband watching his wife buy gifts for another man with money stolen from his own mother and saying nothing. Neither possibility softened the blow, but they did give her focus, because now she had the outline of something bigger than just a family dispute. This wasn't about a single fraudulent loan. It was an operation, a scheme with multiple layers, victims, shell identities, bank rejections, stolen funds. She wrote it out in her notebook. Phase 1, gain access to trusted elders' accounts. Phase 2, apply for loans using co-signed authority or forged documents. Phase 3, transfer funds to aliases, Melissa Vaughn. Phase 4, spend lavishly to project false success. Phase 5, abandon and vanish when liability becomes imminent. Her story was currently in Phase 4, but they wouldn't reach Phase 5 because Margaret Holloway was no ordinary victim. She printed every piece of evidence, triple stored the digital backups, and organized her documents in labeled folders. Not to file a complaint, not yet. She was preparing for war. This was no longer just about what they'd done. It was about what she would do next. The grief was still there, buried beneath the surface, but it no longer ruled her. Pain had calcified into clarity. Rage had cooled into precision. And in its place stood a woman who had once managed hundreds of accounts, balanced million-dollar ledgers, and could smell financial manipulation like perfume on a thief. She closed her laptop and looked around her modest apartment. It was humble, but it was hers, and she'd be damned if anyone took it from her again. Margaret stared at the corkboard one last time. It was no longer a web of confusion. It was a map, a plan, and it pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Ethan and Camilla had left behind more than just digital footprints. They'd left behind a trail of victims. She opened a fresh notepad. Her mission was no longer survival. It was justice. She began making calls. The first was to Linda Martinez, her old neighbor who once mentioned lending Ethan money for urgent dental surgery. A fabricated sob story, as Margaret now knew. Linda answered on the second ring. "He never paid me back," she said without needing context. "In fact, after I asked about repayment, he stopped returning my calls." Margaret's voice was calm. "You're not alone, Linda." By the end of the day, she had spoken to 5 more individuals, all different ages, different stories, but identical patterns. Co-signed loans, emergency transfers, promises that turned to silence. She didn't tell them everything yet, just enough. "There's going to be a meeting," Margaret said. "I think it's time we stop being victims and start being witnesses." The community center on Monroe Street hadn't changed in decades. Fluorescent lights, foldable chairs, a faint smell of dust and linoleum. At 6:30 p.m., Margaret arrived first. By 7:00, 8 people sat in a half circle, each holding manila envelopes, some bulging with papers, others slim with screenshots. Margaret stood at the front, her age no longer a limitation, but a symbol of experience. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know how hard it is to admit what's been done to us, but we're not here to shame anyone. We're here to take action." She passed out printed timelines. Camilla and Ethan's names were listed side by side. Below them, a flowchart of dates, amounts, victim names, and transaction routes. "This isn't coincidence," Margaret said. "It's a system, one they've run for years." The room murmured. An older man named Dennis raised his hand. "They told me the money was for IVF, that Camilla was infertile and needed one last chance." A woman beside him, younger, clenched her fists. "Ethan told me he needed help starting his own business, even showed me fake emails from investors." The emotions were thick: shame, anger, betrayal. But something else began to emerge too, a sense of power, of unity. Then came the twist no one expected. A voice at the back of the room broke the tension. "I tried to stop him years ago." Everyone turned. A man stood in the shadows near the doorway. Early 40s, slightly overweight but with clear eyes and a voice that carried. "My name's Kyle Jensen. Ethan and I were best friends in college. We started a business together. At least I thought we did." Margaret stepped forward. "You knew about this?" Kyle nodded. "I didn't know the full extent, but I knew Ethan was reckless. He used people, borrowed from friends, never paid back, lied when it suited him. I cut ties after he forged my signature on a joint application for a business loan. Lost me 10 grand. I warned others. Nobody listened." "Did you report it?" "Tried. But back then, it was small amounts. No one took it seriously. It was always just short of criminal." Margaret saw the weight in Kyle's shoulders, the pain of knowing the truth too soon and being ignored. "Well," she said gently, "they'll listen now." Because now they had more than suspicions. They had dates, signatures, receipts, hotel logs, banking trails, and a network of victims willing to step forward. With Kyle's testimony, the pattern was complete. The next step was legal. Margaret had already contacted Patricia Stone, a fraud attorney specializing in elder abuse and financial crimes. The woman had a reputation, methodical, fierce, and deeply empathetic toward victims. They met the next morning. Patricia arrived with a legal pad and a steel briefcase. Her demeanor reminded Margaret of herself, back in her banking days, sharp, prepared, no time for nonsense. "You've done impressive work," Patricia said after reviewing the files. "This isn't just fraud. This is premeditated, organized financial exploitation." "What's the best way forward?" Margaret asked. "Class action civil suit for restitution, simultaneous criminal charges filed for financial abuse, identity theft, and possibly RICO violations, depending on how far this network goes." RICO. Margaret's heart quickened. That wasn't small claims court. That was federal. Patricia smiled. With the documentation you've collected and a group of cooperating witnesses, we're not just filing a lawsuit, we're launching a campaign. Margaret left the office that day with more than hope. She left with a legal partner, a timeline, a strategy, and most importantly, a team. Her silent uprising had begun, and the silence was about to end. The envelope was thick and carefully sealed, addressed to Human Resources at Lumina Marketing, Camilla's upscale workplace in downtown Spokane. Inside, photographs time-stamped, watermarked, each capturing a moment too damning to ignore. Margaret made 10 more copies. She mailed them to people who mattered in Camilla's world. Friends who filled her Instagram feed, family members who'd toasted at her wedding, even her yoga instructor who once posted, "Camilla is the most graceful soul I've ever met." They would all learn the truth. There was no dramatic explosion, no cinematic confrontation. Instead, Camilla's life unraveled like a silent thread pulled from an expensive designer dress. By Monday morning, the receptionist at Lumina received the envelope. She handed it to the head of HR, who paused her coffee mid-sip upon seeing the contents. The printed photographs were crystal clear. Camilla in intimate poses with Marcus, holding hands, feeding him dessert, gifting a luxury watch, purchased under Margaret's forged credit line. An internal investigation was launched within hours. By Tuesday, Camilla was suspended indefinitely, pending further review of conduct incompatible with company values. Her co-workers, once envious of her tailored outfits and curated lifestyle, now whispered behind coffee machines and Slack channels. "Did you see the photos? Was that really her? That's fraud, right?" Her social media imploded. Margaret didn't need to lift another finger. A chain reaction had begun. Camilla posted a vague story on Instagram that night, a blurry selfie with the caption, "People will twist your story. Stay true to yourself." But the comments were brutal. "Stay true while stealing from the elderly? That man isn't your husband, is it? You're canceled, Camilla." She disabled comments by morning. By Thursday, she deleted her accounts entirely. Margaret sat at her kitchen table sipping tea with calm hands. She hadn't ruined Camilla. Camilla had simply been revealed. And Ethan? He was next. The community center group had grown to a dozen victims, each willing to speak, each armed with their own truth. Patricia, the attorney, had begun contacting media outlets under non-disclosure guidance, preparing a press packet to hit once court proceedings began. But even before the headlines, the whispers reached Ethan's ears. It started at work. A junior colleague forwarded him an anonymous email. Inside, copies of the hotel photos, Camilla's fake ID trail, and a short note, "Your mother deserves better." He laughed it off at first, but then the stares began. At meetings, co-workers sat farther from him. At lunch, no one joined his table. Then came the worst. His manager called him in for a routine review, then subtly suggested he take some personal time until things settled down. At home, the silence grew thick. Camilla barely spoke. She blamed stress. Margaret knew better. Camilla was spiraling, losing control, and knew the walls were closing in. Then came the HOA notice, neighbors filing noise complaints citing disruptive behaviors and concerns about community safety. Not real safety concerns, just reputation-driven pettiness. Ethan's castle had become a prison. Margaret heard about it not from Ethan, but from Kyle, the old friend turned key witness. He lived 2 streets away from the Andersons. "They don't even make eye contact at the mailbox anymore," Kyle said. People crossed the street. One lady stopped her book club just because Camilla was in it. Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't smile. It wasn't satisfaction. Not really, but it was something. Justice, maybe. She wanted to feel triumphant, but that wasn't the emotion that stayed with her. What lingered was grief. She remembered the Ethan who'd scraped his knees riding bikes, who once wrote her a Mother's Day poem so earnest it made her cry. The boy who clutched her hand at his father's funeral, promising to always protect her. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd watched his wife siphon the life out of Margaret's retirement and said nothing, and yet he was still her son. That thought cut deepest of all. She opened her drawer and pulled out an old photo. Ethan at 12, his cheeks round, his smile pure. She traced his face with her finger, then set it down. Because while grief demanded reflection, justice demanded resolve. Her job wasn't finished. Patricia had finalized the legal filings. In 2 days, the lawsuit would go public, civil and criminal. The press would follow. The evidence would no longer be whispered in small rooms. It would be shouted from headlines. And Margaret wouldn't be a footnote. She'd be the lead. The woman who organized victims, who uncovered financial crimes, who exposed a polished couple for the frauds they truly were. As she stared out her kitchen window, the wind swept leaves across the sidewalk. The world moved on. People lived their lives, unaware that a quiet revolution had just changed everything. She didn't hate Ethan, but she no longer protected him. That was the price of betrayal. She lifted her cup, sipped her tea, and whispered to no one in particular, "You underestimated the wrong old woman." The morning air was crisp with late spring resolve. Margaret adjusted her coat collar as she stepped onto the courthouse steps, flanked by Linda, Kyle, Dennis, and the others. Her unlikely coalition, each carrying their own folders, hearts racing under composed exteriors. Inside, the marble floors echoed with tension. Patricia Stone stood waiting, clipboard in hand, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that exuded confidence and purpose. She gave Margaret a quick nod. "They're ready for us." The courtroom wasn't dramatic like in movies. No thunderous gavel, no gasps. Just a quiet buzz of activity as lawyers whispered, papers rustled, and the weight of decisions floated invisibly over the wooden benches. Margaret took her seat in the front row beside Linda, her eyes locked on the double doors. Then Ethan walked in. For a moment she didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, paler. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a wrinkled navy blazer and scuffed shoes. His hair, once obsessively styled, fell limp, but what struck her most was his posture, hunched, shoulders drawn forward like a man trying to disappear into himself. He didn't look at her, didn't scan the room. His eyes went straight to the defense table, where a tired public defender waited. The judge entered, and everyone stood. "Case number 2674, the clerk announced. State of Washington versus Ethan Holloway. Charges: financial elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud." Margaret kept her breath steady. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. The judge, a stern woman named Harrison, surveyed the courtroom with the gaze of someone who'd seen everything twice. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you've been charged with multiple counts. How do you plead?" Ethan rose slowly, cleared his throat. "Guilty, Your Honor." The words floated into the room like a prayer, or perhaps a confession. A soft murmur stirred behind Margaret. Patricia stood next. "Your Honor, we wish to submit documentation from 12 victims spanning a 3-year period. Additionally, we have surveillance footage, photographic evidence, and direct testimony tying Mr. Holloway to a pattern of systematic financial exploitation." The judge nodded. "Accepted into record." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in release. Camilla was not present. Rumor had it she'd fled town 2 days after her suspension from Lumina Marketing. Her Instagram was wiped. Her phone disconnected. Word had reached Patricia that she'd liquidated what was left of her assets to pay down personal credit card debt, but the larger loans, the ones in Margaret's name, remained unpaid. And Marcus, gone. No forwarding address, no trace. Twist 11 had landed like a quiet storm. Camilla, once the orchestrator, was now a ghost drowning in debt, with no one left to manipulate. Marcus had taken what he could and vanished, leaving her to face the fallout alone. Margaret had not expected to feel pity. But as Patricia laid out Camilla's role in the scheme, fake identities, financial paper trails, connections to Marcus, Margaret felt an ache. Not for Camilla, but for the version of herself that had once believed in family. When it was Margaret's turn to testify, she stood firmly at the witness box. Her voice was steady. "I am not here for revenge," she began. "I am here because I believed love was enough, that being a good mother, a loyal mother, would protect me, but love doesn't protect you from lies, from theft, from betrayal." She paused, meeting Ethan's eyes across the courtroom. "I gave my son everything, and he let someone else steal it from me, then stood by and watched." The silence in the room was heavy. She handed over her final piece of evidence, a letter Camilla had written months ago to a loan officer, using Margaret's forged signature and a fabricated illness excuse to rush approval. The judge read it, then nodded. Patricia called Kyle next, followed by Linda and two others. Each spoke clearly, passionately, not like victims, but like people finally allowed to name the wound. When the final testimonies concluded, the judge called for recess. Margaret stepped outside into the cool hallway. Her legs felt like stone. She leaned against the wall, the tension slowly draining. Footsteps approached. She turned. Ethan. He stood there, wringing his hands, eyes rimmed red. "I didn't know about Marcus," he said hoarsely. "Not all of it. I thought Camilla was just borrowing. I didn't know she—" Margaret raised her hand gently. "Stop." He froze. "I'm not here to rescue you, not anymore." A flicker of guilt twisted his face. "I'm sorry, Mom." "So am I," she said softly. He waited for forgiveness, for an embrace, maybe even absolution. It didn't come. She turned away back toward the courtroom, because justice didn't end in a hug. It ended in accountability. The courtroom had emptied, leaving only the echoes of truth and judgment hanging in the vaulted ceilings. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the dusty gravitas of justice in motion. Margaret watched in quiet resolve as the judge's final decision sealed their fate. "You will be sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation," Judge Harrison announced. "You are also ordered to provide full financial restitution to the victims within 5 years. Failure to do so will result in immediate revocation of probation and conversion to a custodial sentence." The words settled like stones in the hush of the courtroom. Ethan stared at the gallery, at Margaret without recognition. The man she once knew, full of promise and pride, was gone. In his place stood someone diminished by shame and loss, estranged from the affections only motherhood can give, and she felt nothing but calm. Additionally, the judge continued, flipping through the case file, the court authorizes asset seizure, including all properties, vehicles, and liquid assets owned by Mr. Holloway or Ms. Camilla Holloway. These assets are to be liquidated to satisfy restitution orders for the victims. Another blow, final, but fair. A wave of release washed through Margaret. Victory not born of vengeance, but rightful accountability. As the knock came signaling the end, murmurs filled the gallery. Margaret rose, feeling the weight of history in the hush of that moment. She walked past Ethan in the aisle. His eyes met hers briefly. No pleading, no defiance, just a look of someone finally facing consequences. He stepped back. She walked forward. Outside the courthouse, sunlight warmed her face, but did little to thaw the cold knot in her chest. Linda approached, smiling with relief and victory. "We did it," Linda whispered, embracing Margaret softly. Margaret nodded, wrapping her arms around her old friend. She wasn't sure she could manage words, just the quiet satisfaction of resolution. The group gathered on the steps. Media cameras clicked, but Margaret had no interest in attention. The headlines would run tomorrow. "Retired banker brings family to justice," they might say. But her story wasn't about fame. It was about healing. Kyle looked at her and smiled gently. "You changed everything," he said. Margaret shook her head. "No, I just didn't give up." She met Ethan's gaze again, firm but without anger. He looked away. Weeks later, Back in her apartment, the first quiet trace of peace returned. The small space, modest desk, threadbare armchair, kettle that whistled at 7 felt like an anchor for a life reclaimed. Margaret poured a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, listening to the hum of the street. An envelope lay on the table that hadn't been there before. She opened it slowly. Inside was a typed letter and a small stack of official-looking documents. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Holloway, my name is Ellen Parker. I'm 72 and live just 2 blocks from you. I received a substantial bill from my bank last month, a loan I didn't take out. My daughter helped manage my mail when I fell ill, but now it appears she used my information too. I don't know where to begin. I'm frightened and ashamed. I heard about your case and see what you did for us. I wonder if you could help me understand what to do next. Thank you for being a light in a very dark moment." Margaret's eyes blurred. She didn't feel sorrow for herself anymore, and yet this letter felt significant. Another woman, another victim, reaching out not for vengeance, but for guidance. She picked up the phone and called Ellen. Her voice was gentle. "I'd be honored to help." In the following days, Margaret responded with compassion and clarity. She shared her annotated timeline, recommended legal contacts, and assured Ellen that she was not alone. She walked her through a letter calling for a fair credit investigation and drafting responses to collection agencies. These weren't triumphant fights. There were no courts, no media headlines, just small private acts of solidarity across mail and phone lines. Margaret sat in her apartment one evening, surrounded by patient correspondence and cup warmth, and realized she had found something unexpected: peace. She thought of Ethan, who would be watched closely, watched by probation officers, governable by a sentence that would shadow his steps, a sentence born of his own making. She thought of Camilla, gone. Her absence spoke volumes, gone along with Marcus. Gone with stolen money, illusions of power, and a life built on the suffering of others. And she thought of herself, no longer defined by betrayal, no longer waiting for forgiveness or recognition. She had rebuilt her life in silence. Days turned into weeks. She began volunteering at the local senior center, offering workshops on basic financial security, elder fraud awareness, and emotional recovery after betrayal. She used her banking knowledge, once weaponized against her, as a shield for others. She told stories, not of revenge, but of resilience. Not about lawsuits, but about prevention. Not about family collapse, but about forging new communities. Her group grew. People started to trust her. Pamphlets she designed circulated in neighborhoods. She wrote that line in her journal one quiet afternoon. You underestimated the wrong old woman because she had become something more. She was someone others looked to for answers, an example that surviving betrayal didn't require vengeance. It required strength and clarity. In the end, her calm victory stood for more than personal justice. It became a beacon for those unheard, unprotected, overlooked. A whisper turned into a guide. A shame turned into a cause. And Margaret Holloway, 67, retired, wronged, was living testament that the quietest revolutions can begin in broken trust and end in reclaimed purpose.